Welcome to After Further Consideration, a DEI-focused podcast brought to you by Enrollify and Element 451. I'm Dr. Cody Nielsen, Executive Director of Convergent Strategies and Higher Education faculty member.
And I'm Dr. Tamika Ferguson, Assistant Dean for Student Affairs and Inclusive Excellence, and an Assistant Professor at Virginia Commonwealth University School of Education. We're sitting down with seasoned change leaders for candid chats about responsive leadership, addressing campus crises, navigating institutional shifts, and fostering sustainable change, all through the lens of equity and inclusion.
Join us every other Tuesday to learn about these leaders' real-life challenges, lessons learned, and the innovative solutions they develop to tackle these complex issues.
Our goal is to help you drive positive and inclusive change on your campus.
After Further Consideration is a part of the Enrollify Network, a community of innovators, thinkers, and doers dedicated to revolutionizing higher education. Learn new skills, find your next big idea, and network with the industry's best minds at enrollify.org.
Enrollify is presented by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform, helping institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.
Today's guest is Dr. OiYan Poon, who's an educator, author, speaker, and race and education scholar. She's the co-director of the College Admissions Futures CoLab, through which she is serving as a consultant to Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker's Office of Higher Education Policy. Dr. Poon's research has focused on racial policies and politics of Asian Americans, education access, affirmative action, and admission systems and practices. She's the author of Asian American is Not a Color, Conversations on Race, Affirmative Action, and Family, which recently won the ASH 2024 Outstanding Book Award. Dr. Poon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to join you today.
Yeah, Tamika and I are really excited to have you. You're helping to kick off our winter 2025 or spring 2025 season here in January. As we get started, there's a lot of folks in the higher education world who have learned about you through your recent book, but we want to learn more about you and having you take us back. So can you begin today by sort of telling us about your leadership story and sort of take us back about how you ended up in the role that you're doing today?
My parents immigrated from Hong Kong to Boston. And so I was born in Boston, born and raised in Massachusetts. My grandparents were in Boston, Chinatown. I think a major theme that my brothers and I continually process through is kind of the financial instability and traumas that we experienced and the racial traumas we experienced growing up in our community in Western Massachusetts, so right outside of Springfield, Massachusetts. And for the higher ed folks out there, not too far from the 5 colleges over there. So I think it's just been like a lifetime of healing from these various kinds of intersecting traumas growing up, and a lot of joy as well within our communities. So I don't want to be like, this is a terrible, sad story, right? But these are the things that really shaped who I am today and why I became so committed to studying and trying to figure out how to make changes around creating better futures for ourselves and our families and communities. So I guess, with the higher ed journey story, it's a kind of a typical one where I was in college and was an RA. And while I was an RA, I took my first ethnic studies course that blew my mind, right? Really gave me the language to understand and make sense and meaning and empowered me and really motivated me to want to lead for change for a more racially just and humane society. That combined with being an RA, I was like, oh, higher ed, we can make some changes. And having that ethnic studies background, race studies background, started opening me up to ideas of like, how specifically do we change it? Understanding and seeing the systems. I often describe it as like my matrix moment, where all of a sudden I was like, oh, I'm seeing all the code all of a sudden and all the things that were so confusing. And so, from being an RA, went into a student affairs professional career in like 2001. Really, I was a month or two into my first postmaster's position at George Mason University when 9/11 happened. My apartment building was 2 blocks from the Pentagon, and I was in multicultural affairs. Our campus had a significant amount of Muslim and Middle Eastern students. We were the only campus not to shut down on 9/11 on the Eastern Seaboard, I want to say. It was something. I will say, Tamika, I know you're in Virginia,
Yes.
so you may be familiar with GMU.
Yes.
Um, and yeah, so from there, I was hired to be the first student affairs officer at UC Davis across the country. So that was my first time on the West Coast, and I was in a position that was created because of a string of anti-Asian violence on campus and in the surrounding area. Again, in kind of what we called multicultural affairs, but in California after Proposition 209 and the ban on affirmative action there. As an early-ish career student affairs professional there, tasked to work on a lot of retention, recruitment, and campus climate issues, mind you, in a post-affirmative action world in California, notably. I kept running into these moments of, hey, I'm seeing all these students and going to the student affairs and administrative leadership on campus and saying, I think these are the things we need to do to improve retention, persistence, graduation rates, across these different populations. And I felt like I was having like these great ideas and they were student generated ideas. And I kept getting the retort, where's the evidence? Where's the data? That was then what really made me, I got really annoyed by that because it kept coming back like, oh, that's an interesting idea. Where's the data? Where's the evidence? And so finally, one of the professors I was working with at Davis said to me, well, why don't you go get the data and the evidence? And I was like, I don't know how to do that. And he goes, well, that's what a PhD is for. And for the first time, someone explained to me what a PhD was. And so I was like, oh, I can learn how to do research and communicate findings for social justice action and change in higher education. And so that's what motivated me to get a PhD. I know a lot of people who and it can be a both and, right? Like a lot of people go and they're like, it's really this prestige motivator. I want this PhD. I want people to call me doctor. Suddenly, Wendy Osefo's image just came into my head from Real Housewives of Potomac, for example, right? And I'm like, that was never my motivator. My motivator was, give me an expansive toolbox so I can help and contribute towards making some change. And so that's how I entered my academic career. Had a lovely tenure track and then tenured career at Loyola Chicago and then Colorado State University. But at the end of the day, I realized after living in 4 different time zones in this country, I got to be where my family needs to be and my husband needs to be here in Chicago. I love Chicago. My daughter was born here in Chicago. And so I left the academy for the Spencer Foundation. People think that that's leaving the academy, but that's not really. I think I explained it to you, Cody, as like entering education academy core. And but it really opened my eyes to a whole next level of understanding about like possibilities for leading for change in higher education and beyond. And so I think that's pretty much been my journey. I'm back here in Chicago now. I'm no longer at the Spencer Foundation. I am, as you mentioned, Cody, I kind of describe it as like, I'm kind of having a midlife crisis right now. I'm a consultant and an author, and I get to hang out with the very smart people who work for the governor's office here in Illinois. Next week, leading a convening with all the higher ed leaders in the state of Illinois. So all 12 universities, all 48 community colleges. It's been really fun and meaningful.
What I like about your story is that even as you described the reason behind getting a PhD, it was always about the work. And you've used phrases like, the motivator and leading for change. I love finding that why. And I think it's also reflective in the jobs that you've been able to work in, the career trajectory that you have. Some people think that getting a PhD, it's just all about the data, and other people feel like it's all about the publications. Could you maybe share some tidbits and some information for folks who really just are about the work and about the practical work that might not be tenure, that might not be a white paper or a report, right? Where do you find like that the spaces of impact in what you do that still are very integral and very important to the academy and doing so much practice based and impactful work?
I think what I've learned over the last few decades is that so much of the work and possibility comes in these daily interactions and the relationships we build. And even with these convenings that I've been helping to lead across the state here in Illinois with all the chancellors and all the presidents and, state legislators and agency heads and all of this, this is the fifth one that we're having next week. And it's just been about collective learning and relationships and finding having these kind of like setting the agenda on here's the important things that we need to change on and how do we do it, and really having these hard conversations on how to do it in a very tangible way. Similarly, a lot of the work that I was doing at Spencer, what they've been after is how do we get research to go beyond just oh wow, this is a great top tier journal article and not just doing research for research sake. And I think there's a culture among researchers today where we want our research to matter, right? We want our research to make a difference. So how do you exactly do that? Because it's one thing to just say like, I want that, that's my goal, that's my vision, but really to like lay out the day-to-day daily practice and plans to influence the field and understand the systems at play, like faculty reward structures, administrative reward structures, and how do you influence them in a way towards a singular or a shared vision for equity going forward?
I really love that because I think, especially as we lean into that side of the house, I do think that I often talk to practitioners sort of day to day and week to week that don't feel like they are able to really create those sort of significant moments of change. They're sort of stuck in that sort of endless loop. Or, for faculty, it's like, well, what do you want to do as a research study? And, I feel like the number of times I've been in those meetings where it's like, well, what do you want to study? And it's like, is anybody really excited about doing this research? Because in the
Yeah.
end, it just feels like you're just sort of chasing tenure or chasing like the expectation of production versus like the real work. So
Yeah. I mean, I learned a lot at Spencer. And one thing was if you look at, they've been putting out annual reports now, and you'll see the demographic shifts and who is applying to grants at Spencer and who's getting rewarded grants and who the reviewers are all at the same time, right? And you talk about this endless loop, Cody, and I think that's what Spencer really taught me was big transformative change happens in that endless loop in little daily ways, right? The little routines that maintain inequalities. If we shift those little routines even a little bit, there can be big change. And I think those trend lines and those annual reports really like, oh, okay, yeah, it's and it has to go beyond policy, right? We often celebrate big legal changes as like, whoa, this is a momentous change. But what I'm realizing is passing a law is maybe like 5% of the battle to really make something happen.
What I appreciate about what you said is that it's in the little loops. And I think that sometimes we get so excited about the vision and the potential and the summary of what we wrote about the grant. As a person who, loves grant work, I think we get so excited when we're thinking about the impact that we know can happen. But what you talked about was very much about sustainable actions and
Mm-hmm.
consistency. And that is, I think, one of the benefits of having the blend and the culture that you described about scholars and folks wanting to get their work out there to make a difference, there is a blending that's happening where we have a lot of practitioners, a lot of people who are in the community. It's not just community engaged work, it's really collaboration. I love
Mm-hmm.
seeing a lot of the work that happens even across different schools. Some of the funding models that are out there from different foundations that are saying we need collaboration. We want you to have a multi-system approach, a partner with the school. We're seeing so much change. And being in an ed leadership department, I see that change happening with partnerships with K-12 and higher ed and school districts. And it's changing the community. And it's really awesome to watch that. And
Yeah.
as we move forward, Things that we're interested here in unpacking really are defining moments that have been these pivotal change moments in your life as a leader. And so, could you maybe share one or two defining moments or crises that have shifted how you lead? And what we're interested in is really what are those moments that we can learn about?
I shared about why I decided to leave my student affairs practitioner career to get a PhD and become a researcher and a faculty member. I think a more recent kind of crisis of identity or defining moment in how I lead is when I became a mom. I had a really solid academic career at that point and was like being rewarded for good research. But honestly, like, how many people were reading my stuff? Right? It was like, oh, great, it's behind all these paywalls, and how is it affecting people? I have this book, and Asian American is not a color, and those were actually her words when she was 3, and it really crystallized for me. I have all this data, research, findings that I could use to answer her, but I didn't know how to answer her without this very long book. And it made me realize, it's this very truism, which is research and data don't speak for themselves. But how are we as scholars speaking the research into implications for the world? And it goes back to something we were talking about earlier, which is those relationships and research partnerships. I think there are different approaches to those research partnerships, and unfortunately a lot of them can be superficial, but it's time consuming but very rewarding and important to develop genuine research partnerships. And it's those relationships that really allow those findings to have real implications for change. And so I think I've been on this journey in the last 10 years or so around how do we communicate? What's the best way, channels for communicating and making our research matter in the world for equity? I have these wonderful relationships with college admissions professionals and leaders in the field because so much of my research has to do with that functional area, enrollment management. And I've learned so much from these relationships that I have. The group texts are very live. Um, and it's been a lot of fun, and I learn a lot from them, and they let me ask these questions off the record and whatever, but it's giving me stronger insights so that I can then design research in a way that also makes more sense and has stronger possibilities for making its way into the world of practice.
One of the things I like about that is as a person who also works in enrollment management and has, worked in the side of trying to go into the schools, sometimes there is a missing language between the scholar and between the work of an admissions professional. And so I enjoy the lab work that you do through your lab because I think that that's very powerful that you get the opportunity to partner with really awesome people through your College Admissions Futures collaborative. Could you maybe talk about how you're using that work as a co-director to really influence some of the work that you say and that you're writing about?
Yeah, so the CoLab is like, it's not an actual like physical research center or anything. It's more of it's a network of a group of friend scholars. There's like Dominique Baker and Kelly Rosinger and Julie Park and Brian Kim. Brian Kim is really fascinating because he does this really cutting edge work on machine learning and language learning, but his day job is at the Common App. Every research project that we do as a group, we also, and then I think, who else just joined us? Anyway, check out our website, cafcolab.org. So we've got this like fantastic network, brilliant people I learn from all the time. But the thing is, every single one of us, almost all of us, has this practical background and either having been an admissions reader, currently working in the field, or formerly, I think Kelly and Dominique were both admissions officers at one point. But then every research project that we have, we bring in these enrollment management leaders in the field so that we can have these conversations about how can we position research better to make a change in that field. And that there's a trust, because we know right now, because that field is so litigious, right? Everyone's afraid of being sued, That trust is really important. But, and Tamika, you mentioned the language difference. Like it goes, trust has to do with like a commonality and a shared interest and even down to communication and language. Perfect example is in the admissions field, they often use the term case study. Well, as research scholars, we use the term case study very differently, right? And there was this moment where I was facilitating a conversation between a unnamed scholar, love this person to death, and some admissions practitioners. And this one admissions dean said, "Well, case studies, you know what I mean, right? Like how we use case studies in the field." And this scholar was like, "Of course I know what a case study is. It's a research methodology." Right? And this person was like, "Oh, honey, no, not at all."
I had that happen once. I was trying to Google case studies for an EDD class. And we were trying to talk about ethics, and all I came up with was like a journal that talked about case studies and some stuff on Google. Everything else is like dissertations. And I was like, well, I'll just teach people how to write them. And shout out to Dr. Mahogany Shaw for teaching me and my students how to use case studies to do practice based work. But it is absolutely hilarious just the difference in language and who's accountable for those differences. It's folks like
Mm-hmm.
you to help with that translation.
Right, right. And that's just one example. There's so many moments where we're like, "Oh, we're not talking about the same thing. We're not even in the same room right now. We need to figure out where we are."
One of the things that's really interesting to me is, you've shifted your role, a little bit out of the academy. You sort of straddle this line now, inside and outside. Like, how do you see that as sort of impacting your sort of identity as a leader now that you've moved into this, sort of external role and you say you're having your midlife crisis as a consultant and as an author?
You both mentioned so much of my identity, and this is true, is about the work and what I want to achieve with the work and how I contribute and what I contribute towards. So I don't think my work was ever my identity. So being a student affairs professional was never my identity, right? But then somehow becoming a tenure track and tenured faculty member, I think that balance shifted a bit. And I started to, and we see this all the time where people take on um, their professional roles into how they define themselves. Um, and so I think because I took on a little bit more, "Oh, I'm a professor," right? Honestly, Real Housewives of Potomac, we're seeing Wendy Osefo, Dr. Wendy, going through this right now, right? A little bit. Um, and yeah, like I think it's been a little bit of an identity shift and reminding myself, actually, reminding myself like, wow, I'm having more fun in my work life now than I ever have before. And it's okay. And I loved how Dr. Eddie Moore in one of your episodes mentioned how it's important to be about the work. And that's the important part, right? It's not really about, and taking on remembering this attitude of abundance, right? Like that I need to embrace the abundance because I have been very fortunate throughout my life. I've worked my butt off, and then that opportunity and that hard work have come together. And I think I have this opportunity and privilege now to be okay that I'm not in a contractual, like long term professional position right now because I don't have to worry. And this is my processing through my, as I started out in this podcast episode about my lifelong financial traumas and healing from that, right? That's what's pushing me into this, like, oh, I need to look at LinkedIn to see if are there jobs that I can take on right now. But that has, in the last year, I've learned I have then taken on too many jobs. And now I'm just running myself ragged and tired. And I need to just embrace the things, the work in my schedule that is bringing me joy, and just allow the universe to be abundant right now, even as we enter this very scary new administration.
I'm really appreciative that you just said that because, like, one thing that I will say is that we often ask our guests to talk about your self-care. And it does come sometimes at the end, but I think what you're giving is that sort of defined wisdom for us. So I would love if you were just willing to just briefly just expand on that. Like, how else are you taking care of yourself? Obviously, you're no longer looking on LinkedIn, necessarily looking for the next jobs, but how else are you like taking care of yourself? Because you do allude to the Trump administration that's coming, or, perhaps already in by the time that this episode drops for us. But like, tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. I think because, when I was on faculty, I was teaching the organization and governance class. I've become, a lot of my research is organizational studies in higher education. And, I used to assign Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategy, and she has this idea that is so important, that change is really the small is all idea, right? That that's where we have to keep ourselves. And because I think, at least for myself, when I think about all the misery and awfulness and the vileness, right, it's overwhelming. And then I get stuck. I'm so overwhelmed. And then I start, then it has implications for my mental health. And then I'm just no good to anybody because I'm just frozen in place in fear and anxiety. But it's remembering small is all, but then it also, again, it's the relational building, the community building, and knowing who my people are and understanding that. I think in American culture, we often think about like, oh, you too, all it takes is one person to do something, right? But I don't think it's that. I think it's really collective change, right? We have to build communities. Yeah. So I think for self-care, it's this mindset shift partly. And then it's also about wellness. Shout out to all the premenopausal sisters out there. I'm here. Right. And it's like, it's real, right? And so I've been taking my physical health very seriously. A couple of years ago, a friend of mine, I think like the fifth or sixth close friend of mine around my age, died of a heart attack, right? And it's been like that. And they're all men of color, one woman of color for the last like 6 or 7 years, every year. And 2 years ago, that friend who passed away suddenly, that was a wake-up call for me that I had not been taking care of my physical health at all. And so this is not a plug or an ad for Orange Theory, but that works for me. Whatever works, like I think do that, right? And for Orange Theory, because it's such a habit-forming kind of, it's gamifying working out and nutrition. It works for me. 10 years ago, I was constantly practicing yoga. I still take a lot of those principles into the work, into my, breathing and self-care work today, and just like bullet journaling. So just, again, taking things little by little and not feeling overwhelmed. Like last night, I just decided, okay, I have this major deadline today, but I'm just going to take the time after dinner to spend time with my daughter who's been going through some tough stuff at school. Right. And so I was just like, no, this is much more important. I can wake up early the next morning, which is what I did today. And I'll get it done. And remembering that people are also forgiving. I work with fantastic people who are also willing to give me grace. But that has to start with me giving myself grace.
As a mom, I just want to like snap and clap the whole time you were talking, because thinking about legacy is so important, and that is so empowering about what you just shared was that you keep starting with yourself, right? Like you started with yourself and your family for your career. You started with like the motivator and doing the work because it was important to you, even for the change from administrator to becoming a member of the academy. And it seems as though it's not like you're seeking a balance. And I think sometimes we talk to professionals and they're trying to describe a professional trajectory that's based on promotion and rewards. And everything that I'm gleaning from you today is about impact, whether that's impact to the Asian American community, if that's impact for your daughter, if that's impact for you. And I
Mm.
just wanted to say that I appreciate that. It's refreshing to have women and strong women use their voice and their decisions to be almost this model of how someone else can lead, be in this possibility model, which really came to fruition for me when Dr. Lori Patton Davis used that within her work when she was president of ASH. And so I just interested when you start to think about your influence as a leader. I mean, you are an author, you're a scholar, you are a mentor, you are a researcher, you're a director, you're doing a lot of things. When you think about your impact as a leader, how do you continuously remain centered on equity in what you're doing? How do you make sure that no matter how big the idea or project that you're working on, or how many people are reaching out to you and knowing that you have national and international impact, how do you remain grounded in the equity work as a leader?
Mm, that is a great question. Um, I guess it's not about the titles for me because I don't know how to. Yeah, it is about, that's all it is for me, is just living out my values, I guess. And writing is really healing for me. Doing this work, staying busy is healing for me. I mean, I keep joking with my husband about how I'm going to retire tomorrow, but he won't let me. He also keeps saying, that that's not who I am. And I think he's right, is just like, I do want to stay active, but also, there is a balance, I think, because I want to keep doing the work, but I was no longer willing to live where the job required me to live, right? I needed to be in the community and in relationship with the people I wanted to be. I needed to be here in Chicago, and there wasn't a tenured position open for me when I was like, it's time to go home. But you just have to stay committed and clear. And, I have like post-it notes sometimes here and there all over the house, where, especially around my office area, where it's like, this is what it's about. At the end of the day, I have a very sassy daughter who will keep me grounded. And I have people around me that keep me accountable, right? Whether it's my family or my close friends. A lot of my closest friends, none of them are academics. And I think that's important to me, is to just be very close to people in all kind of work. And I get to learn from them that way.
As we approach the end of our conversation, one of the things I would love for you to share, because there's so many nuggets, thinking about, it's not about the title, thinking about the impact of your work. You've dropped so much wisdom here today, and we appreciate it. But if you were to provide actionable strategies to those leaders who are listening right now, and it's leaders at any capacity, new leaders, mid-career, just leaders who want to make an impact, who want to remain committed to the work and not about the titles, and they share that with you, what are maybe one or two actionable strategies that you can provide to them to remain committed to doing good work?
I think the thing that comes to mind right off the top right now for me is living a lit review. I know it's kind of weird. I used to teach lit review, and I'm on that. I still am on. I'm about to step off the editorial board for review of ed research, but I really enjoy lit reviews because, and I try to live lit reviews in leadership too, in every community or organization I'm in, because I don't want to play like, oh, Christopher Columbus was good. I don't want to Columbus stuff, right? Things have been happening for many, many years before your arrival as a leader. You have to try to listen and understand what that story was before you, in order to understand where you enter and what entry point is the most effective to build on top of what's already come before you, to then build towards a vision of the future that you share with others around you. Right. And so I think oftentimes as leaders, and it goes back to this very like mainstream American culture of just like, I'm going to show up as this leader. And we celebrate leadership this way, right? The singular leader that shows up and is going to like somehow change everything. We see this with like, I was just at a campus with their first Black female president, and it's only been 6 months since she's been in office, and people are already grumbling about how she didn't do this and she didn't do that. And I'm like, it's been 6 months, people. Like, give her some time to like really take into totality the story and the stories that is this institution that's been around for hundreds of years. Or even give them the space to understand what was the journey in the last 10 years, so as to be strategic and effective in her leading to, towards the next step and maybe changing the trajectory of an institution that was never built for people like us to begin with, right? Like, let's just take the time for that reflection, self-reflection, organizational reflection, collective reflection, before we go and act willy-nilly.
That really hits for me, because a lot of my work with organizations and institutions really comes back, I think, that collective reflection, that self-reflection, to the use of Sankofa and the idea of, it's okay to go back and fetch that which we have been left behind, because if we don't understand our history, we can't know where we're going. And so placing ourselves in that larger story, I think it's just a really good last piece of wisdom for us. So, or at least the next piece of wisdom for us. So I want to say, I want to say on behalf of Tamika and I, OiYan, thank you so much for joining us on this week's episode of After Further Consideration. We were both so giddy to have you on the show, and you're living right up to all of the conversations that we always want to have with all of you that are out there. And just thankful that you joined us today and gave us a number of pieces of wisdom for us to think about.
Well, thank you so much. You are both so wonderful and nurturing and encouraging. This is just what I needed in a tough, slog to the end of, I know this is in early 2025 that people are listening to this, but that end of December, y'all. Woo!
Well, thank you again. And thanks everybody for joining us for this week's episode. That wraps up today's episode of After Further Consideration. We hope our conversation has sparked new ideas and provided valuable insights for your own work in advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion on your campus and beyond.
Thank you for listening in. Remember, fostering meaningful change is a journey. Be encouraged and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible in creating a more inclusive educational environment. After Further Consideration is a part of the Enrollify podcast network. If you like this podcast, chances are you'll like other Enrollify shows too.
Our podcast network is growing by the month, and we've got a plethora of marketing, enrollment, and higher ed technology shows that are jam-packed with stories, ideas, and frameworks, all designed to empower you to be a better higher ed professional.
Our shows feature a selection of the industry's best as your host. Learn from Brian Piper, Allison Tercio, Eddie Francis, and so many other of your favorite leaders in higher ed.
Enrollify is presented by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform helping institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.